I love the Appalachian Mountains and the region around it. It's so beautiful. It's so peaceful and eerie, and just everything I love about nature. Guys, personally, I'm from North Carolina, so I grew up around the Appalachian Mountains. I'm in western North Carolina, and I love this region so much. But there are so many horror stories, freaky stuff, sightings, weird mysteries that happened in this region, and I wanted to put it all into a video. So, let's get into the horrors of the Appalachian Mountains. Be sure to subscribe if you want more videos like this, or follow if you're on Spotify. I've done the horrors of the deep ocean, the horrors of Yosemite National Park. I love these kinds of videos, so there's going to be a lot more in the future. Also, I have an Instagram where you can, follow me. And then I have a Discord where we can hang out and talk and stuff. So, join that if you're interested. But let's get into this. The Appalachian Mountains run along the eastern side of North America, stretching roughly 1,500 miles from Newfoundland in Canada down to central Alabama in the United States. They pass through states like Maine, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Major subranges include the Blue Ridge, which is where I am. Other subranges include the Great Smoky Mountains and the Alleghenies. The Appalachian Trail alone cuts through 14 states, crossing into some of the most remote terrain in the U.S. Geologically, these mountains are very, very old. They're ancient. They're over 480 million years old. They formed during a series of continental collisions long before the Atlantic Ocean even existed in its current shape. At one point, they were likely comparable in height to today's major mountain systems. Hundreds of millions of years of erosion wore them down into long ridge lines and rounded peaks. And that amount of age and amount of time really matters because it created a landscape full of deep forests, extensive cave systems, sinkholes, and complicated underground geology. It's a very old, very ancient piece of land that has a lot of personality because of how old it is. It had enough time to gain that personality. The region, commonly referred to as Appalachia, in general covers parts of 13 states, and it has its own cultural identity. Isolation shaped much of its history. Many communities developed in narrow valleys, often called hollers, separated by steep ridges. For generations, travel between towns could take hours. Coal mining, logging, and railroad expansion brought economic growth, but also left behind abandoned infrastructure. Also stripped hillsides and environmental damage, and that all still affects parts of the region today. Now, I'm going to glaze the Appalachian Mountains some more. Environmentally, the Appalachians contain some of the most biodiverse temperate forests in the world. Dense canopy cover can block out sunlight. Fog settles low in valleys, especially in areas like the Great Smoky Mountains. Wildlife is active and visible. Black bears, coyotes, bobcats, wild boar. In certain areas, cell service disappears quickly once you leave main roads. A person can step off trail and lose their bearings within minutes. And all of that comes together to create this setting of the Appalachian Mountains. Such great history, both geologically and culturally, in this area. I love it so much. And let's get into the horrors of it. I'm so excited. The 1996 Shenandoah murders in May 1996. Two young women, 24-year-old Julie Williams and 26-year-old Lolly Winans, who were an experienced outdoors couple, traveled to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia for a backcountry hiking trip along with Lolly's golden retriever dog named Tosh. But after camping near the Skyland area of the park, which is actually a well-developed area with lodges and maintained trails that families with children visit regularly, the two women were last seen on May 24th. And when they failed to return home, their vehicle was found at a trailhead, and Taj was found alive, but completely alone. And on June 1st, 1996, their bodies were discovered at their campsite near the Bridle Trail, where investigators found that both women had been bound, sexually assaulted, and shot. And because the murders occurred on federal land, the FBI joined the investigation, where they collected DNA evidence, including semen, and developed a DNA profile of an unknown male suspect. But in 1996, DNA technology was not as advanced, so they had a profile, but no match for years, and the case went cold while theories circulated about possible anti-LGBTQ hate, crime motives, or connections to other unsolved Virginia murders. But then decades later, forensic genealogy advanced, and investigators could upload crime scene DNA to genealogical databases and build family trees. So the FBI revisited the case, and in 2024 they announced they had identified the killer as Walter Leo Jackson Sr., who had died in 2018 at age 69. And his DNA matched the profile from the crime scene. And it was discovered that Jackson had a violent history, including a 1989 conviction for abduction with intent to defile in Culpeper County, Virginia, where he had served time and was later released, and he was never arrested for the Shenandoah murders while alive. So the case was formally closed in 2024, giving the family some closure, but raising serious questions about why a convicted violent offender was free to kill again. In May 1981, two young hikers named Laura Susan Lawley Ramsey and Robert Mountford Jr. were camping along the Appalachian Trail in southwest Virginia in Giles County near the Wapiti Shelter along Dismal Creek, which is a section of the trail that runs through the Blue Ridge Mountains and includes established shelters and campsites used by both through hikers and weekend hikers. But in mid-May, the couple disappeared while hiking, and their bodies were later discovered near the trail where both had been murdered, and local and state authorities treated it as a homicide investigation from the start because violence along the Appalachian Trail was rare and deeply unsettling for the hiking community, and investigators soon focused on a local man named Randall Lee Smith, who became the primary suspect and was arrested and charged. And in 1982, Randall Lee Smith pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But despite the 30-year sentence, Smith did not remain incarcerated for the full term because he was released after serving only part of his sentence. And then in May 2008, more than 2 decades after the 1981 murders, Smith was accused of shooting 2 men near Dismal Creek in the same general Appalachian Trail corridor where Ramsey and Mountford had been killed, and the 2 victims survived. And authorities identified Smith as a suspect and launched a search and took him back into custody after a pursuit during which a vehicle was involved, and Smith sustained injuries, and he was hospitalized and then transferred to jail, and then he died in custody, bringing a violent end to the story of a killer who was released early and struck again. In June 1969, the Martin family drove from Knoxville, Tennessee to spend Father's Day weekend camping in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and on this trip were 6-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin, his older brother Douglas, their father William Bill Martin, and their grandfather Clyde Martin. And their route started at Cades Cove, hiking up to Russell Field, and then continuing to Spence Field, which is a grassy bald near the Appalachian Trail surrounded by steep forested slopes and drainages with ravines, laurel thickets, and dense undergrowth. And on June 14, 1969, the second day of the trip, the Martins reached Spence Field and met another Knoxville family called the Key family. And the children started playing together and decided to play a prank on the adults by splitting up and circling around to jump out and scare them. And Dennis, who was smaller, was told to hide closer behind a bush at the edge of the field. And Bill Martin watched this happen, but then he couldn't see Dennis anymore. And a few minutes passed, but Dennis did not come out. So Bill started searching and even ran about 2 miles down the trail, but found nothing. And by afternoon, it was clear this was not a child just hiding too well. So rangers were notified, and an organized search began that evening. But the conditions that night were terrible because around dusk, heavy rain moved in, with roughly 3 inches falling in a few hours, and temperatures dropped into the low 50s Fahrenheit, with fog and low clouds settling in, which for a 6-year-old in a red t-shirt, shorts, and shoes was a serious survival problem with hypothermia and disorientation. And the rain also destroyed any tracks or clues near Spence Field. And the search grew into the largest in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history, with roughly 1,400 people covering 56 square miles of rugged terrain, including park rangers, local volunteers, National Guard units, and even Green Beret Special Forces teams. But despite all of this, they found no clothing, no body, and no confirmed trace of Dennis. And the search was officially suspended on September 14, 1969, costing an estimated $2.5 million. And over the years, several key details emerged, including child-sized footprints showing one barefoot and one wearing a shoe that retired Ranger Dwight McCarter believes were Dennis's, but officials dismissed as belonging to a Boy Scout, and a sighting by Harold Key of a shaggy man carrying something red about 5 miles from Spence Field about an hour after Dennis vanished. And years later, an illegal ginseng digger claimed he had found a small human skeleton and a child's shoes in a remote area in the early 1980s, but a search of that location turned up nothing. And officially, investigators have 3 main theories: lost and exposure, where Dennis got turned around and died of hypothermia or injury with his body never found; animal predation by a bear or hog, but with no evidence of an attack; or abduction by a human, which is supported by the Shaggy Man sighting. And outside of official reports, there is internet folklore about wild men or feral people living deep in the Smokies, and that the Green Berets were brought in to hunt them. But no official documentation supports this. And to this day, Dennis Lloyd Martin is still missing, and his family never gave up searching. On Friday, October 8, 1976, 16-year-old Teresa Trini Lynn Gibson left Bearden High School in Knoxville, Tennessee for a horticulture field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And she was a quiet, good student who was 5 feet 3 inches tall, about 115 pounds, with brown hair and green eyes. And that day she wore a blue blouse, a blue and white striped sweater, jeans, blue Adidas shoes, and a heavy brown plaid jacket that she had borrowed from a classmate. And the trip was led by horticulture teacher Wayne Dunlap, with about 38 to 40 students on the bus. And Dunlap had not told them the destination ahead of time because he wanted it to be a surprise. So the bus left Knoxville around 9 a.m. and drove to the Clingmans Dome area, which is one of the highest points in the Smokies, with an observation tower and several popular trails. And the plan was to hike the Forney Ridge Trail out to Andrews Bald to look at plants and trees, and then come back the same way. And Dunlap gave specific instructions to not take side trails, not go past Andrews Bald, and be back at the bus by 3:30 p.m. And the weather was chilly, overcast, and breezy, with some fog and low clouds typical for October in the high Smokies. And as they hiked, the students naturally broke into smaller groups based on pace. And Trini moved between groups, but for much of the hike toward Andrews Bald, she was with Robert Simpson, the classmate whose jacket she was wearing. And they reached the Bald and spent time there. And around 1:30 p.m., Trini left ahead of Robert and started back toward the parking area alone. And on the return leg, other students saw her up ahead walking alone. And in one widely repeated account, classmates said they saw her bend down or step off the trail to the right just for a moment. And when they looked again, she was gone. And her last confirmed sighting was around 3 p.m. somewhere between Andrews Bald and the Clingmans Dome parking lot. And when students drifted back to the bus, people realized Trini was not there. And the teacher checked obvious spots like the parking area, observation tower, and restrooms, but found no sign. So he contacted park rangers, and an evening search began. And over the following days, they brought in tracking dogs, closed sections of road, and used aircraft. And her parents provided clothing from home for the dogs to lock onto her scent. And multiple dogs picked up Trini's scent where the Forney Ridge Trail meets the Appalachian Trail. And from their handlers said the dogs followed it past the Clingmans Dome Tower and down toward the road in the direction of Newfound Gap. And the trail ended about 1.5 miles from Newfound Gap near a roadside pull-off. And searchers also found a partially open beer can and 3 cigarette butts near where Trini stepped off the trail. And later at the roadside location where the dogs lost the scent, they found more cigarette butts of the same brand. And Trini was not known to smoke. And none of the classmates admitted bringing beer or cigarettes. But despite all of this, the search produced 0 confirmed physical evidence of Trini, with no body and no clothing found. And the official search was suspended by the end of October 1976, though the case remains open. And there are 4 main theories. First, lost and exposure, where she stepped off the trail and slipped into a ravine or thick brush and died of injuries or exposure with her body never found. Second, abduction by a stranger, where someone was watching and intercepted her and took her to a car at the roadside pull-off, supported by the scent trail and cigarette butts and beer can. Third, foul play by someone she knew, as her family had concerns about a young man named Kelvin Bowman who had been shot in the foot by Trini's mother during an attempted break-in and had allegedly made threats. And some online discussions also mention Robert Simpson, but no charges were ever filed. And fourth, runaway, which was briefly considered by investigators, but she left no packed bag, no cash stash, and no note. And vanishing from a supervised school trip with no clear way off the mountain makes this very unlikely. And on top of these, there are more out there theories, including Bigfoot or portals showing up in FOIA requests. And Trenny Gibson is still listed as missing, presumed lost, or injured in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And a tree and plaque at Bearden High School honor her. On Christmas Eve 1945, George and Jenny Sauter were at home near Fayetteville, West Virginia, with 9 of their 10 children. And the Sauters were an Italian-American family, where George had immigrated from Tula, Sardinia, and built a decent life running a trucking and coal-hauling business. An important context is that George was very outspoken against Mussolini and fascist Italy, and had gotten into arguments about it with other Italian immigrants. And in the months before the fire, there were weird incidents, including a life insurance salesman who had been turned down, reportedly telling George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of his anti-Mussolini comments. And another man came to the house asking about work and pointed to the fuse box, saying this will cause a fire someday, even though George had recently had the wiring checked and passed by the power company. And Christmas Eve itself started normally, with the oldest daughter, Marion, coming home from her job with presents and the younger kids begging to stay up late. So around 10 p.m. Jenny agreed, as long as 14-year-old Maurice and 10-year-old Louis remembered to bring in the cows and feed the chickens before bed, and George and some older boys went to sleep, while Jenny took 3-year-old Sylvia upstairs and went to bed. And around 12:30 a.m. the phone rang, and Jenny answered to hear a woman's voice she didn't recognize ask for a name Jenny didn't know. And Jenny could hear clinking glasses and laughter in the background, and the caller let out a strange laugh before hanging up. And Jenny noticed the lights were still on and curtains not drawn downstairs, so she turned off the lights and closed the curtains and went back to bed. And around 1 a.m. Jenny heard a loud bang on the roof and then a rolling sound, but she didn't see anything and went back to sleep. And about 30 minutes later, she woke again, this time smelling smoke, and found that George's office room was on fire around the fuse box and phone line. And she woke George, and the house, largely made of wood, started burning fast. And Jenny and George managed to get 4 children out, which were Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. But the other 5 children believed to be in the upstairs bedroom, which were Maurice, aged 14, Martha, aged 12, Louis, aged 10, Jenny, aged 8, and Betty, aged 5, could not be reached because the staircase was already engulfed, and George tried to break a window from outside and badly cut his arm, and the ladder that normally leaned against the house to reach the attic window was gone and was later found thrown down an embankment away from the house. And the water barrel they used for emergencies was frozen solid. And George tried to drive 2 of his work trucks up to the house to use as makeshift ladders, but neither truck would start despite having run fine the day before. So all they could do was stand outside with the 4 surviving children and watch the house burn, which collapsed in about 45 minutes. And calling for help was a mess because the house phone line was dead, and when Marion ran to a neighbor's home and another motorist tried from a nearby tavern, they both had trouble reaching the operator. And the Fayetteville Fire Department was a small volunteer outfit where the chief didn't even drive the truck himself, so they had to round up a driver and volunteers one by one. And the crew didn't arrive until several hours after the fire, and the official conclusion was that the 5 missing children died in the fire, and the heat was intense enough to fully consume their remains, and death certificates were issued on December 30th, 1945, listing cause as fire or suffocation. And the fire was officially blamed on faulty wiring, despite George's insistence that the system had been recently inspected. And George bulldozed what remained of the house and covered it with about 5 feet of dirt and turned the site into a small memorial garden. But George and Jenny never believed the official story because a local crematorium worker told Jenny that even at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, bones remained, and their house had burned for only 45 minutes. And Jenny did her own experiments burning animal bones and always had solid fragments left. And there were other suspicious details, including the ladder found thrown in a ditch away from the home, the phone line appearing to have been cut at the pole rather than burned, both of George's trucks failing at the same time after working fine the day before, the bang on the roof that Jenny wondered about, and a small hard dark green rubber object that young Sylvia found in the yard months later, which George thought looked like an incendiary grenade. And there were sightings, including a woman watching the fire who said she saw some of the Sauter children looking out of a car window as it drove away during the blaze. And another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston who claimed she served breakfast to 5 children the next morning accompanied by adults in a car with Florida plates. And a hotel operator in Charleston who said she saw the 5 children about a week after the fire with 2 women of Italian extraction. And the family hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley, who discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George had somehow ended up on the coroner's jury. That ruled the fire accidental, and Fire Chief F.J. Morris reportedly found some kind of heart in the ashes and hid it in a metal box. But when confronted, he led George and Tinsley to a spot where he'd allegedly burned the box, and inside was a lump of tissue that a local funeral director said was fresh beef liver that had never been burned. And later rumors claimed Morris admitted planting the liver to get the family to stop digging. And in 1949, the Sodders pushed for a more serious excavation. And a Washington, D.C. pathologist examined material from the basement and found 4 lumbar vertebrae, which were human spine bones. And the Smithsonian analyzed them and concluded the vertebrae likely came from someone 16 to 22 years old, which is older than any missing Sodder child since the oldest was 14, and the bones showed no signs of fire damage. And the Smithsonian said they were probably from filled dirt used to level the basement and stated that if 5 children had died in that fire, you would expect to find far more skeletal material than just 4 vertebrae. And with official channels basically done, the Sodders turned to the public and in the early 1950s put up a huge billboard along the road with the 5 children's photos and the story, and a reward eventually up to $10,000. And it became a local landmark and stayed up until 1989, shortly after Jenny died. And in the 1960s, the family received a photo in the mail of a young man in his 20s with the back scribbled with Louis Sodder and a few cryptic lines. And George and Jenny believed the man looked like an older version of their missing son, but nothing concrete came from it. And the family's working theory was that the children had been abducted, possibly by people tied to the Sicilian mafia, either to punish George for his politics or to extort money. Where someone set the house on fire as cover while others took the children out beforehand and possibly smuggled them back to Italy, while some modern writers lean more toward the mundane explanation that the kids really did die in the fire, and between the coal-fired basement and the intensity of the burn and a rushed, imperfect search, their remains were either destroyed or missed. And George died in 1968, still convinced his children had been taken. And Jenny wore black and tended the memorial garden for the rest of her life until she died in 1989. And the youngest daughter, Sylvia, who had been 3 at the time of the fire, spent her life saying she believed her siblings survived and that she felt obligated to keep the case alive. And the Sodder children case remains one of Appalachia's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Elva Zona Hester was born around 1873 and grew up near Richlands in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. And by 1896, she was a young woman with a child out of wedlock living with her family in a small rural church-driven community where reputation mattered. And in October 1896, a blacksmith named Edward Stribling Trout Shoe arrived in the county and took work at a local shop. And he went by Trout or Edward and was well-dressed, charming, and very focused on finding a wife quickly, and Zona met him. Soon after, he came to town, and within a short time they were married, despite her mother, Mary Jane Hester, openly disliking him from the start. And for a few months, nothing outwardly dramatic happened, although some accounts say Zona had been ill that winter and was under the care of Dr. George Knapp for female troubles, which possibly meant a pregnancy or miscarriage, but that was not confirmed. And on January 23, 1897, a cold Saturday in the middle of the Appalachian winter, Trout Shoe went to the nearby home of Aunt Martha Jones and asked if her 11-year-old son Andy Jones could come to the house to do some chores and run an errand for Zona. And Andy walked to the small log house where the Shoes lived, and when he went inside, he found Zona lying at the foot of the stairs, stretched out on the floor with her feet together and one hand across her stomach and her head tilted to one side. And Andy was so frightened, he ran back home, and his mother sent for the doctor and local authorities. And Dr. Knapp did not reach the house for about an hour. And by the time he arrived, Trout had already carried Zona's body upstairs to the bedroom and laid her out on the bed and had washed and dressed her himself, which was something that the women in the community usually did. And he put her in a high-neck dress with a stiff collar and a veil over her face. And his behavior was very strange because he stayed pressed right up against the body, cradling her head and crying loudly and fussing, with the scarf and pillows under her neck while the doctor tried to examine her. And Dr. Knapp noted some bruising or discoloration around her neck, but whenever he tried to get a better look, Trout became agitated and sobbed harder and shifted her head in his arms. So between the grief display and cultural norms, Dr. Knapp backed off and did only a cursory exam and recorded the cause of death as everlasting faint, which was a vague Victorian term for sudden collapse, and later amended it to complications of pregnancy. And Zona's body was taken back to her family home in the Richlands area. And during the wake, Trout insisted on keeping a scarf tied tightly around her neck and propped her head with pillows and a rolled-up cloth, claiming the scarf was her favorite and he wanted her buried in it. And neighbors later said he became visibly upset if anyone got too close to her head or tried to adjust the scarf or pillows. And her mother, Mary Jane, watched all of this, and she already disliked Trout and had protested the marriage and had a bad feeling about him from the beginning. And now her daughter was suddenly dead, and the doctor hadn't really examined her, and the husband seemed almost obsessed with protecting her neck from scrutiny. And during the wake, Mary Jane later said she had felt something wrong in the room, describing it as a chill sense that the body was not at peace. And Zona was buried in a little cemetery near Soul Chapel, just a short drive off what would later become U.S. Route 60 through the Greenbrier Valley. And on paper the case was finished, but Mary Jane refused to accept it. So she went home and took down a sheet from the line that had been touching Zona's body and spread it out on her bed. And according to her, the sheet changed color and seemed to hold a stain that she couldn't wash out. And that, combined with everything she had seen at the wake, convinced her that her daughter had been murdered. So she started praying and asking her daughter to come back and tell her the truth. And according to Mary Jane Hester, her prayers were answered because she later testified that for 4 nights in a row, Zona's spirit came to her, at first appearing as a bright light that gradually took on the shape of her daughter, bringing with it a deep, unnatural cold. And on one of those nights, Mary Jane said the figure sat at the foot of her bed and told her exactly what happened. And Zona's ghost, in her mother's account, said that her husband, Trout Shue, was a violent man who abused her. And on the day she died, he came home angry because he thought she hadn't cooked meat for supper. And during the argument, he grabbed her by the throat and snapped her neck. And to prove it, the apparition supposedly turned its head all the way around until it was facing backward. And armed with this story, Mary Jane went to the prosecuting attorney John Alfred Preston in Lewisburg and spent hours in his office. And whether Preston believed the ghost story personally does not show up in the record, but he was bothered by how little real medical examination had taken place. And there were also rumors in the community that Trout had behaved oddly and that people suspected foul play. So Preston decided there was enough concern to reopen things, and he requested that Zona's body be exhumed for a proper autopsy. And on February 22, 1897, less than a month after the burial, Zona's body was dug up and taken to a nearby one-room schoolhouse for the autopsy, where 3 doctors, including Dr. Knapp, examined her for about 3 hours. And what they found was that her neck was broken between the first and second vertebrae, her windpipe was crushed, and there were clear signs of violence, including finger marks on the throat, torn ligaments, and damage to the front of the neck, which was definitely not just someone falling down the stairs. And at that point, Trout Shue was charged and arrested with murder. And while he sat in jail waiting for trial, more of his background came out, including that he had been married twice before, where one wife had divorced him and accused him of extreme cruelty, and another had died under suspicious circumstances less than a day after they married. And people also recalled how he talked about wanting to have 7 wives, with Zona being his third. And the trial began on June 22, 1897 in Greenbrier County, and prosecutor Preston kept his questioning grounded on cause of death, autopsy findings, Trout's behavior, and his history. And he did not try to build a legal case around ghost testimony. But the ghost story did make it into the courtroom because the defense attorney brought it up, hoping to paint Mary Jane as unreliable or unbalanced by cross-examining her about the supposed visits from Zona's spirit, expecting her story to sound ridiculous and shake her credibility. But the plan backfired because by all accounts, Mary Jane stayed calm and completely consistent and repeated the same details she had told Preston, and insisted she had seen and heard her daughter and that the story was real. And because the defense had brought it up, the judge had limited ability to tell the jury to ignore it. And in a heavily religious mountain community where belief in visions and signs was already baked into culture, her testimony landed harder than the lawyer expected. But even so, when you strip the legend back to the court record, the conviction rested on physical evidence because the autopsy proved Zona died from manual strangulation and a broken neck, and Trout had interfered with the initial exam and had a suspicious marital history and could not offer a believable alternative explanation, and the jury deliberated and found him guilty of first-degree murder, recommending mercy. And the judge sentenced him to life in prison at the state penitentiary in Moundsville in the northern West Virginia Panhandle. And not long after, a small lynch mob formed and tried to take him from the jail, but the sheriff dispersed them before they reached him. And Trout Shue died a few years later on March 13, 1900 in prison during an epidemic, and was buried in an unmarked grave. And in the 1990s, West Virginia put up an official historical marker near Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery, where Zona is buried. And the text on it reads that Zona Hester Shue is interred in the nearby cemetery, and her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother and described how she was killed by her husband Edward. An autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account, and Edward was found guilty of murder and sentenced to the state prison. And it is the only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. And the Greenbrier ghost remains the only known case in American legal history where testimony from a spirit helped secure a murder conviction. If you drive out into the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina east of the main tourist strip in Asheville, you eventually hit a low tree-covered ridge called Brown Mountain, which sits in Burke County on the edge of Pisgah National Forest, looking over the Linville Gorge and the foothills that lead down out of the southern Appalachians. And on clear nights, people have been going up to overlooks along NC Highway 181 and the Blue Ridge Parkway for over a century to watch for something that should not really be there, which are glowing, drifting lights that seem to rise above the dark outline of the mountain, hang there, and then fade. And people describe them as small, bright orbs, usually white, yellow, or reddish, appearing above the ridgeline. And sometimes they seem to move horizontally, and sometimes they float up and disappear. And they do not always show up and do not follow a perfect schedule, because on some nights multiple lights are seen at once, and on others nothing happens at all. And the most common viewing spots are the Brown Mountain Overlook on NC 181 between mile markers 20 and 21, the Lost Cove and Green Mountain Overlooks on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and Wiseman's View above Linville Gorge. And the first published reports of mysterious lights over Brown Mountain date back to the early 1910s, when a 1913 article in the Charlotte Daily Observer talked about red lights appearing punctually above the horizon at set times in the evening, and locals started writing to politicians asking for an investigation, and the whole thing snowballed into a minor regional mystery. And this same era is when electricity and rail traffic were expanding into western North Carolina, because the Southern Railway had trains running through the area with new extremely bright locomotive headlights rated around 600,000 candle power installed just a few years before the first newspaper mentions. And at the same time, more towns and industrial sites down in the valleys were getting electric lights. And researchers who have gone back through travel logs and local histories have pointed out that no one mentioned the Brown Mountain lights in print before about 1910, even though lots of people were writing about odd and supernatural things in the area. And because the stories would not die, the U.S. Geological Survey got pulled in when in 1913 geologist D.B. Sterrett came to the area, and standing at the famous Loveland Hotel vantage point, he mapped the sight lines and compared them to the Southern Railway tracks and schedules. And his conclusion was that many of the mysterious lights people were seeing matched the route and timing of train headlights in the valley. But that did not end it, because a 1916 flood washed out tracks and halted train traffic for a while, yet people said they still saw lights. So in 1922, the USGS sent out another scientist named George R. Mansfield to do a more thorough survey, and Mansfield spent weeks in the field with maps and an Alliday telescope logging when and where lights appeared and what was in those directions. And his official report concluded that the lights could be fully accounted for by a combination of distant train headlights, automobile headlights, and brush or campfires, which are all normal light sources refracted and distorted by the complex terrain and atmospheric conditions in the Appalachians. And on paper, that should have killed the mystery, because a federal scientist came in and did the math and said these are just lights from human activity bouncing around a mountain valley. But it did not stop the stories, because over the rest of the 20th century, the Brown Mountain Lights shifted from a "what is this problem" into a full-on Appalachian ghost legend with ballads, campfire tales, TV shows, and paranormal books, all turning a technical optical issue into something that really lives alongside a bunch of other mountain horror stories. And as time passed, storytellers in the region started to backfill the mystery with older origin stories, including Native American legends about Native women searching for their dead warriors on the battlefield. And another claimed that the lights are the ghost of an enslaved man wandering the mountains with a lantern, still looking for the master he lost. And another version casting them as settler women roaming the ridge in grief. And these stories layer very human tragedy onto what might just be distant headlights, which is exactly how a lot of Appalachian ghost lore works. And the legend got a big boost in the 20th century from music, because in 1961, bluegrass musician Scotty Wiseman wrote the legend of the Brown Mountain Lights using a family story about his great-uncle Fate Wiseman as the hook. And in that version, the light is a lantern carried by a faithful old slave who returns from the grave night after night, searching the mountain for his lost master. And the song was recorded by multiple bluegrass and country artists, including the Country Gentlemen and the Kingston Trio, and it pretty much locked Brown Mountain into popular culture. And by the mid to late 1900s, the lights also got pulled into UFO culture when writer Ralph Lale, who owned a rock shop in the area, claimed that he had contacted aliens on Brown Mountain and traveled with them to Venus, and even kept what he said was a mummified alien body on display, and his 1965 self-published book, plus the general rise of UFO interest after World War II, pushed the lights into a different category. And from there, Brown Mountain started showing up all over pop culture, including an episode of The X-Files called Field Trip that used a case of missing hikers in the Brown Mountains as the basis for a parasitic fungus horror story, and paranormal shows like Ancient Aliens and Weird or would have covered the lights. And a 2014 horror movie called Alien Abduction marketed itself as being based on a true phenomenon because of these lights. And even on the science side, people never really stopped poking at it, because in the 2010s, Appalachian State University installed low-light cameras overlooking the Brown Mountain and Linville Gorge area and racked up thousands of hours of footage trying to catch something truly unexplainable. But the results were underwhelming for the most part, with lots of normal lights and nothing that really stood out as a repeatable "this breaks physics" kind of event. And the narrator of the video says this is one of their favorite urban legends with so much in it, and they would love to make a whole video about it if viewers want. And in the end, science says the lights are train headlights, car headlights, and brush fires refracted and distorted by Appalachian terrain and atmospheric conditions. But legend says they are ghosts, spirits, Native American women, enslaved men, Civil War soldiers, or aliens. And regardless of the explanation, the Brown Mountain Lights remain one of the most enduring and beloved mysteries of the Appalachian Mountains.